Welcome to the South African Civil Society Information Service. I'm Fazila Farouk, coming to you today from Stellenbosch in the Western Cape. South Africans seem to be facing our moment of reckoning. 20 years after apartheid, this country's racial and economic architecture remains unchanged. White South Africans still own much of the wealth of this country, our economy, while black South Africans, apart from a narrow black elite, largely remain in poverty. Our guest today, Professor Sampie Terblanche, has been reflecting and writing about South Africa's poverty and inequality for many, many years. We're here today to talk to him about how it is that we've arrived at this point 20 years after democracy, where the status quo in this country hasn't changed. It's actually an opportune moment to be talking to him. A year ago, in fact, almost exactly to a day a year ago, his book, Lost in Transformation, was published. And it looks at a 25-year period in South Africa. It looks at the history of our transition to democracy. And Professor Terblanche has some incredibly special insights into what happened historically in South Africa that informs the current state that the country is in today. Welcome to Saxis, Professor Terblanche.
Thank you.
Professor Terblanche, before I ask you to talk about your book, I'd like you to talk a little bit about yourself first for the benefit of our viewers. Tell them about your interest in South Africa's political economy and looking at poverty and inequality in South Africa. How is it that this became your area of specialization?
I am emeritus professor in economics at the University of Stellenbosch. I lectured for almost 50 years at the university, and I specialized in economic history, history of economic thought, and on modern economic systems. I have not lecturing anymore. In April this year, I turned 80 years, and I can look back on a very interesting and very challenging life up till now. There is a special reason why I'm writing on the poverty problem. It so happened that I was appointed in 1973 as a member of the Erica Tron Commission. It was a commission that looked to the socio-economic position of the colored society in South Africa. And I was chairperson of the group on economics and labor, and I became interested in the whole phenomena of poverty. I read every American book that was published on the poverty problem, the so-called vicious circle of poverty. I called it the problem of the position of chronic community poverty. Sorry about it. So in due time, I became also interested in the poverty problem in the ranks of the African population group. I published a book in 2002 on the history of inequality in South Africa from 1652 till 2002, and the book has done quite well. This book, Lost in Transformation, is a rethink about the situation after 10 years. And I have reason to be even more pessimistic as what I have been when I wrote my history of inequality.
Well, before I get into talking more generally about the book and the issues that you raise in this book, I want to focus on one specific issue. I mean, we're in South Africa at the moment, at a sad moment. Nelson Mandela is lying on his deathbed, and, you know, he unfortunately is not going to see his vision of South Africa, which is a fair and just society. And I want to quote something from your book, something which he said. You say that on 11 February 1990, the day of Nelson Mandela's release from prison, he made the following statement: "The white monopoly of political power must be ended, and we need a fundamental restructuring of our political and economic systems to address the inequalities of apartheid and create a genuine democratic South Africa. That, of course, didn't take place in the last 20 years. And I want you to focus on one particular thing when you answer this for me today. In the book, you contextualize the statement around the fact that he said this, but soon after that, he was having regular meetings with big capital, Harry Oppenheimer in particular, and you talk about an elite compromise that was reached. I do want you to talk a little bit, for the benefit of our audience, about the early 90s and the secret meetings and the deals that were struck back then between the ANC and capital in South Africa. Because I think that's really very instructive for understanding. It's very instructive for understanding where we are today, why things haven't changed.
The whole transition process was orchestrated by the mineral energy complex.
Okay.
And with Harry Oppenheimer and to a lesser extent Anton Rupert, they organized everything. Early in the 1990s, there was regular lunches between Mr. Mandela and Harry Oppenheimer. When I became aware of it, I remember I was furious. For what must they have lunches? But these lunches developed into regular meetings at Little Bronthurst. It is the estate of Harry Oppenheimer. When too many people attend that secret meetings, the meetings was shifted to the Development Bank between Johannesburg and Pretoria. Normally at night, it was easy to park the cars at the back side of the building, and people on the N1 was not aware of that important meetings that was taking place there. And there, the ANC was convinced to forget about their ideas of socialism and large-scale government intervention, etc. You see, America was in the beginning of the 90s, in a mood of triumphalism. Their attitude was that the American model has won, and that everyone must adapt to the American model. So under the pressure of the South African business sector, with pressure from the Americans that had quite a vested interest in South Africa, the ANC was had to give in. You see, on the question, why have they accepted the new liberal model of the Americans? That is definitely not the correct model for South Africa. Is the bargaining power of the business sector and the Americans. But the Americans was also in a position to make use of threatening the ANC, that if you, in a rather diplomatic way, told the ANC, if you are not going to accept our proposals, we can destabilize South Africa. Now, and there is a third possibility that no one can prove, and I can only speculate it. The question is how many money went under the table. So there's the three reasons: convincing the ANC with arguments, threatening them, and buying them out. Two or all three was at play at that time, because from May 1992, the ANC published a document, Ready to Govern. In that document, it was clear. Previously, the ANC talked about growth through redistribution. In that document of 92, they talk about redistribution through growth. And you know, the year policy was announced in 1996, the so-called trickle down. If there is growth in the capitalist sector, then there will be a trickle down to the poor. It is not necessary to have comprehensive redistributive measures, the typical American approach, that with growth there will be trickle down. In November 1993, South Africa was governed by the Transitional Executive Committee, the TEC. There was 8 National Party ministers and 8 senior members of the ANC. And they had a meeting to ask the International Monetary Fund for a loan of $850 million that we need for the transition. And the IMF, it was, of course, everything was arranged, was prepared to give the loan, but they had a document, a statement on economic policy, and said, yes, we will give you the money if all 16 sign the document. And if one read that document, statement on economic policy carefully, it is gear in embryo form. It is the new liberal policy. And so the ANC had no choice. It was, after in 1986 already, when Gorbachev and Reagan reached an agreement to seek negotiated settlements for all the flashpoints in the world. After that, Reagan informed the ANC that he can't any longer, the Soviet Union can't any longer support the ANC military and financially. Now the ANC don't want us to mention that. As they said, Gorbachev only told them to look for a diplomatic solution instead of a military solution. But the truth is that Gorbachev had realized at that stage that the Soviet Union, after the 20 years of Brezhnev, was in a near bankrupt situation. And it is rather remarkable that the American government put quite a lot of pressure on the National Party from Washington, and that Gorbachev from Moscow was putting pressure on the ANC to seek a solution. But it was a solution in the end that the Americans want.
Professor Terblanche, you've been talking about, the pressure that the ANC came under in the early 90s, which forced it, rather than persuaded it to take on a more neoliberal agenda. However, in the last 10 years or so, particularly, the global geopolitics have shifted substantially. South Africa has now also joined the emerging nations, the BRICS group. And it's a group that's meant to be providing a counterbalance in global politics. Why has this new development not in any way influenced the way the South African economy has developed, particularly over the last few years? And why is that not resulting in any changes that benefit more South Africans?
You see, America is in such a powerful position. All the countries that became, all the colonial colonies that became independent since the Second World War, has in fact been recolonized by the American empire. All these colonies have become satellites, dependent satellites of the American empire. That financial power, the cooperative power, the military power of the United States is so awful. After South Africa has been slotted in, the Americans can't be bothered of what we do, that we join the BRICS countries. I think that is a large mistake. If there is in the future a confrontation between BRICS and the United States, the United States can smash us with their financial power, their cooperative power. They let us do our thing, but they are on themselves content that they have South Africa completely under their control.
Let's talk a little bit more in terms of a domestic focus. Let's rather look at capital in South Africa from a domestic perspective. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it will take to bring about some transformation and a bit more of a patriotic orientation in South African capital towards the country? Is it likely to happen?
The South African capital sector are doing excellently. The last 20 years, in spite of the great recession in America, the South African capital sector, look at the prices at the stock exchange, has done excellently, but they are now making their huge profits in foreign countries. We are a sub-empire of the American empire. South African business corporations have become transnational corporations, have production lines in China, in Poland, in Brazil, everywhere. So we are not our own master any longer.
What about then the power of the people, and particularly the power of more empowered groups in South Africa? For example, South Africa's middle class. Do you see any potential for a call for change coming from South Africa's middle class?
In South Africa's middle class, you see, let me put it this way, that 20% of the population is the rich elite. Then there are a 30% that's neither here nor there. They are what one can call a petite bourgeois. And then there is the 50% that is very much impoverished. Now that top 20%, 10 million people, received 75% of total income. 3.7 million of them are white, and 6.3 million are black. But the whites are the richer part of that group. The lower 50% of the population received only 8%, or less than 8% of total income. Now, it is a shocking situation. What we had a political transformation. Apartheid has been abolished, but the political economic system that was put in its place is an ANC dominated political system and an economic system that have become internationalized, that became Americanized. So from the point of view of the lower 50%, nothing of worth have happened. Yes, I must say there is the social grants for elderly people and the social grants for children. That's the only positive thing that happened, but it is not good enough. The living conditions of that lower 50%, 25 million people, of which 24 million is Africans, are rather shocking.
I'd like to shift the conversation a little bit to talking about solutions, possibly. When we were talking earlier on in preparation for the interview, you said that you are going to be reprinting your book and it's going to be translated into Afrikaans, and you're going to be adding a few extra pages, a new chapter if you like, and you're going to be talking a little bit about solutions. I'd really like you to tell us, what you're going to cover by way of, resolving the problems we face in South Africa. But also, in addition to that, an interesting thing that you mentioned to me was in 1997, you made a presentation at the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And in talking about South Africa's problems there, what you suggested was that we needed a wealth tax.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that also?
Yes. I gave evidence in November 1997, a 20-page document. I had the opportunity to read it to the audience. There were business people, the Anglo-American and others were there. They were furious of what I was saying. And in the end, I proposed a wealth tax. Now, people are saying, some rich people, we shouldn't have been so negative about Sampi's wealth tax. But it's now too late. But the government need more money to upgrade the living conditions of the poor. You see, what one must not forget is that when we accepted the American model, we also accepted the Washington Consensus. And according to the Washington Consensus, the ANC can't tax more than 25-26% of the GDP. If we're doing it, that credit evaluation organizations like Standard & Poor and Moody's will degrade us. So we are trapped. The government, it is not possible for it. Even if it, the government, the ANC government, was put in charge of the budget. They can tax people and they can spend it as they like, as long as it's not more than 26%. Now, the ANC government has used a large part of the tax government income in their control for elite formation, for black economic empowerment, affirmative action, corruption, waste, and they are not pressurized to spend more on the poor, and they are also not in a position to increase taxation to 30% of the GDP. I would have been very happy if it was possible for the government to increase taxation by 4 or 5%, and at least furnish the squatter camps with an infrastructure of water, sewage, roads, etc., and to improve the health situation for the mass of people. Now, there is perhaps the possibility that the ANC can get less than 55% next year. If that happened, one can say there is a light at the end of the tunnel. At the moment, there is not a light.
And what is that light?
That light is that the ANC government can be put out of office at an election, that we can become an effective democracy, or functioning democracy.
Would you see it as we need a change of government, or we need the threat of change to get this government to be more responsive to people's needs?
Take the scenario that they get less than 55%. I think we would be surprised when they are looking in the barrel of a gun that they can lost in the 2019 election. It is perhaps not necessary to have another government, but a government that the electorate started to call them to accountability.
Professor Terblanche, one of the things you mention in your book, not in exact words, but you talk about white privilege in South Africa, and you say that white South Africans are not willing to give up their privileges. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
You see, for 100 years, from say 1894 till 1994, the English speakers and the Afrikaans speakers were in an extraordinary privileged position. They have entrenched access to power. They have an entrenched access to property. They have an entrenched access to opportunities, educational and others, and to valuable information. While at the same time, the Africans were statutorily excluded from power, property, opportunities, valuable information. The coloureds had a little bit of it, and the Indians. Only in the 1980s, the blacks started to get access to power, property, opportunities, information. In that 100 years, the whites became rich, became very wealthy, very arrogant, with a rich man's cult of wealth that they don't deserve. Because they became rich, there was unbelievable exploitation of the black majority. The whites were, in the beginning of the 20th century, 20% of the population. When the transition took place in 1949, there was only 10%. 10% of the population has all these entrenched privileges. And to look at all these 4x4 cars that can't be bigger than they are, to look at the monstrosities of houses that are built, the arrogance of the white people. They are not educated about their history. None of us deserve what we have, because it was a cruel system. It was a system of unjust as can be. So the whites will have to make a sacrifice. We cannot grow out of our dismal situation. We will have to do something at the top to improve the position of the 50% at the bottom. There's no other way.
Professor Terblanche, I want to thank you so much for spending this time talking to us at Saxis.
Certainly.
And thank you to our viewers and listeners for joining us at the South African Civil Society Information Service. Remember, if you want more social justice news and analysis, you can get that at our website at www.saxis.org.za.